They were still laughing when Nora Vane walked out of the assayer's office with $4.60 left to her name, which was every penny remaining after the creditors had divided what was owed and taken what was theirs, and the laughter followed her down the main street of Caleta Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1893, the way dry wind follows a person through open country, not malicious exactly, just indifferent, just there. She was 34 years old, and the man who had unmade her life was her own brother-in-law, Aldous Prentice, who had held the deed to the Vane family bakery in his name for reasons that had seemed reasonable once, and now seemed like the oldest kind of foolishness. He had sold the building out from under her on a Tuesday and been on a westbound coach by Wednesday, and the law in Caleta Flats had shrugged in that particular way. Law shrugs when money is already gone. What remained to Nora was a canvas traveling bag, a change of clothes, her mother's rolling pin wrapped in a flour sack, and $4.60. She used 3 of those dollars and all but 2 of those remaining cents to purchase the ruins of a shuttered bakery on the edge of the Mesilla Road. A squat adobe building with a cracked window, a dead oven, and a flour bin so old its hinges had gone to rust, which the town auctioneer, a round man named Fetch, had called a charity sale, if ever there was one, and the assembled dozen onlookers had agreed with the easy enthusiasm of people who have nothing to lose by agreeing. But something was sealed inside that flour bin, something that had waited there through 7 years of silence, and 2 changes of ownership, and 1 long, indifferent desert. And what Nora Vane would find inside it, a single letter, folded in oilskin against the dust, would not only pull her back from the edge of ruin, but would restore to an entire valley community what had been quietly stolen from them, 1 year at a time, for longer than most of them knew. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Vane. If you have ever stood in a place that the world decided was finished, and felt in your own chest that it was not, leave us a word in the comments. We would like very much to hear from you. Nora had grown up in the smell of bread. This is not a small thing to say about a person, and we do not say it lightly, because the smell of bread baking in a stone oven at 4 in the morning is one of those particular sensory facts that shapes the architecture of a person's soul, whether they intend it to or not. Her father, Clement Vane, had operated the Vane family bakery in Caleta Flats since 1871, when the town was young enough to still be figuring out what it wanted to be, and he had built the business the way he built everything, slowly, with attention, with the understanding that quality was not a luxury, but a form of respect paid to the people who would depend on you. Clement was a quiet man with large, flour-dusted hands, and a habit of humming hymns he only half remembered while he worked. And he had taught Nora to bake not as a domestic skill, but as a craft, the way a carpenter teaches joinery, with an insistence on understanding why each step existed before learning how to execute it. Her mother, Delia Vane, had been the mathematician of the operation. Delia kept the ledgers in a small, precise hand that looked almost architectural, and she had a gift for understanding what a community needed before the community had fully articulated the need itself. When the mining operations east of town had expanded and brought with them a surge of single working men with no domestic arrangements, it was Delia who had suggested adding savory meat pasties to the morning offerings, and it was Delia who had priced them at a rate that the men could afford without the bakery suffering for it. She believed in what she called the ecology of a business, the idea that a shop was not an island, but a part of a living system, and that the health of one depended on the health of the whole. Nora had absorbed both of them. She had her father's patience and her mother's arithmetic mind, and she had added to these inheritances a quality that was distinctly her own, a stubbornness so deep it barely registered as stubbornness, because it wore the costume of simple persistence. When a thing needed doing, Nora did not argue with the difficulty of it. She acknowledged the difficulty the way you acknowledge weather. Yes, it is there. Yes, it is unpleasant, and now let us proceed. Her older sister Marguerite had possessed charm and warmth in abundance, and had married Aldous Prentice in 1885 with the family's blessing and with Nora's genuine affection, because in those days Aldous had seemed like a man of some substance, a man who kept his word. Clement Vane died in the winter of 1888 of a chest sickness that came on fast and left no time for arrangements. Delia had followed him 18 months later, as if the partnership had been written into her constitution at a cellular level, and she simply could not sustain the arithmetic of life without her other variable. They left the bakery to Marguerite and Nora jointly, with the deed held in Aldous' name as a practical matter. He was the husband, he was present, it had seemed, at the time of the notarizing, like a formality rather than a vulnerability. Nora had run the bakery through the lean years of 1889 and 1890, when drought and a collapse in silver prices had thinned the town's population and its appetite for anything beyond the most basic provisions. She had adapted. She had simplified the menu, reduced waste to almost nothing, established a credit system for families she knew would make good when the season turned, and she had kept the ovens going through mornings that were so cold her breath preceded her into the building like a scout. She had done all of this because she believed in what the bakery was, not just a commercial enterprise, but a daily, reliable, warm thing in a landscape that was frequently none of those three. Marguerite had helped when she could, but Marguerite had 2 small children and a husband who moved money around in ways that Nora did not fully understand and had not been invited to question. Aldous had a speculator's temperament. He was drawn to the idea of large returns, the way some men are drawn to gambling, not because they are dishonest necessarily, but because they have a genuine and somewhat dangerous faith in their own instincts. He had made several investments in the early 1890s that had not resolved the way he expected, and by the spring of 1893, there were men to whom Aldous Prentice owed money in quantities that would not be satisfied by patience. Nora did not know the full shape of this until the Tuesday in September, when a man from the Territorial Land Office arrived at the bakery with papers and a courteous, impersonal expression, and explained to her that the building and its contents had been sold by Aldous Prentice, acting as deed holder, to satisfy a debt claim, and that she had until the end of the week to vacate. She read the papers 3 times, standing at the counter with her hands pressed flat against the wood, as if she needed the solidity of it beneath her palms, and she understood each word individually and found that she could not make them cohere into something she was willing to accept. She went to the solicitor, she went to the sheriff, she went to the county seat with borrowed fare, and came back having learned that the sale was legal. The deed had been in Aldous' name, and the prior verbal agreement that the bakery belonged equally to both sisters was the kind of arrangement that the law, in its precise and unhelpful way, did not recognize without documentation. Aldous had left Kalita Flats 2 days after the sale. Marguerite and the children had gone with him to a cousin's house in Colorado, and Marguerite had written Nora a letter that was so full of shame and grief and helpless apology that Nora had read it only once and then folded it away in the bottom of her bag, because there was nothing useful she could do with it yet. By the time the auctioneer Fetch called the contents of the bakery for public sale, Nora had been stripped of the ovens, the tables, the display cases, the scales, and the good copper pots her mother had ordered from a catalog in 1880. She had kept her mother's rolling pin because she had been holding it when the assessors arrived and no one had thought to enumerate it. She had $4.60, which was what remained after the creditors took what they were owed, and the sale of her personal effects covered what the creditors had not reached. The old Berendo bakery on the Mesilla Road had been closed since 1886, when its owner, a man named Tomas Berendo, had departed Kalita Flats under circumstances the town had largely forgotten and partly misremembered. It was a small adobe building, sturdy in its bones but neglected in its surfaces, with a packed earth floor, a dome oven that needed replastering, and a flour bin built into the north wall, a deep, wide wooden box with a hinged lid, the kind of fixture that a serious baker constructs to last, and that, in this case, had lasted rather too well, outliving its original purpose and standing now as a piece of furniture in a room that had not been a bakery in 7 years. Fetch had listed it as a lot in the same auction that disposed of Nora's own equipment, and he had described it with the particular enthusiasm auctioneers reserve for things they have no real expectation of selling, a flourish of words that added up to very little. The building was assessed at $12, but no one in Kalita Flats was interested in a broken-down adobe on the wrong end of the Mesilla Road, and after 2 rounds of bidding that produced nothing above $2.50, Fetch had looked at Nora, who was standing at the edge of the assembled crowd with her canvas bag over her shoulder and an expression that he later described to his wife as the most concentrated face I have ever seen on a human being, and he had said, as much to fill the silence as anything, $3 takes it, if anyone has $3. Nora raised her hand. The laughter, when it came, was not cruel. It was the laughter of people who found the situation absurd. A woman who had just lost a perfectly functional bakery, purchasing a derelict one for $3 that she could not afford. One man said something about good money after bad. Another said she might as well have burned the $3 for warmth, which at least would have served a purpose. Fetch took her money with an expression of mild professional embarrassment, handed her the key, which was a large iron thing that had gone green at its teeth, and wished her luck in the tone of voice that means the speaker does not expect luck to be forthcoming. Nora walked to the building that afternoon, let herself in with the green-toothed key, and stood in the interior silence for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness and her breathing slow from the shallow, controlled pace she had maintained all day. The building smelled of old dust and dried clay and something faintly sweet beneath those, which might have been the ghost of bread or might have been the creosote bushes that had grown up against the east wall. The light came in through one cracked window in long, angled bars that caught the suspended dust and made the air look almost solid. She set her bag down. She ran her hands along the oven's exterior and found it cooler than the air outside, which meant the thermal mass was still intact, which meant the oven itself was likely sound beneath its cracked plaster. She checked the floor for soft spots and found none. She examined the window, which could be repaired with a piece of tin if glass was not available. She was, in the methodical, unsentimental way her father had taught her, taking inventory of what she actually had, rather than mourning what she no longer did. It was when she turned to the flour bin that she noticed the lock. Not the rusted iron hasp that held the lid shut, she had seen that from across the room, but a secondary latch on the inside of the bin, a smaller mechanism set into the wood of the right-hand inner wall, which she only discovered because she had lifted the lid all the way back on its hinges and leaned in with the intention of assessing whether the wood had taken moisture damage. The latch was small and brass and had not rusted at all, which meant it had been oiled and used at some point while the bin was active, and it held closed a narrow panel, a false inner wall no more than 3 inches deep, that ran the full length of the bin's right side. She pressed the latch. The panel swung inward. Behind it was a flat oilskin packet tied with a strip of leather that had dried to something like wood, and beneath the packet, held in place by the panel itself, were 2 objects: a small brass key, much newer looking than anything else in the building, and a folded piece of paper that turned out, when Nora carefully opened it with her thumbnail, to be a printed receipt from the Kalita Flats Territorial Bank, dated March 14, 1886, in the amount of $412. Berendo. She stood in the dim room with the receipt in her hands and the oilskin packet on the flour bin's edge, and the afternoon light moving slowly across the packed earth floor, and she felt something shift in the quality of the silence around her, not dramatically, not like a revelation in a story, but quietly, the way the temperature of a room changes when someone opens a distant window. She untied the leather strip from the oilskin packet carefully, because the leather was dry enough to crack and she did not want to damage whatever was inside through haste. Inside the oilskin were 3 items: a letter, written in Spanish in a careful, educated hand on paper that had been preserved nearly perfectly by the oilskin wrapping, a document that appeared to be a deed of some kind, also in Spanish, with an official seal she did not immediately recognize, and a second letter, shorter, in English, written in the same hand as the Spanish letter, but addressed in a way that suggested it was meant for whoever found the packet, rather than for a specific named recipient. Nora read the English letter first. It said, "If you are reading this, then I was not able to return, and I am asking you, whoever you are, to do what I could not. My name is Tomas Berrendo. I built this bakery in 1879. In 1886, I was told by the man who ran the water consortium in this valley that if I did not sell my land, the 42 acres on the east side of the Perdido Creek, which my family has held since the Mexican grant of 1851, he would use his position on the county commission to reclassify my water rights and make my land unfarmable. I did not sell. He found another way. I will not detail it here, except to say that it was effective, and I had to leave. The Spanish letter is my full account of what happened and what was taken. The deed is the original grant deed to the Berrendo land, which I hid here because I did not trust it to travel with me. The bank account holds what I had saved, which I could not withdraw before I left. If you can find my family, I have a daughter named Celestina, who would have been 7 years old when I left, and who I sent to my sister in the town of Mesilla. Please, give her the deed and tell her the land is hers. The man who drove me out was named Harlan Cobb. He is still there. He is always still there. Someone who is not afraid of him needs to say what he did, out loud, in front of people who matter. I was afraid of him. I am not ashamed to say so. He is a man worth being afraid of. But the land belongs to my daughter, and the water belongs to the valley, and both of those things are still true whether or not they have been acknowledged. I am asking you to acknowledge them." Nora read the letter twice. Then she folded it back into the oilskin with the same care she had used to open it, and she sat down on the flour bin's edge in the slant of afternoon light, and she thought. She thought about Harlan Cobb, whom she knew as the chairman of the Kalita Flats Water and Land Consortium, a man of perhaps 60, with a white beard and a courteous manner in public and a reputation for being, as people said, a man who got things done. She had sold bread to his household every week for 5 years and had found him unremarkable. She thought about the 42 acres on the east side of Perdido Creek, which she knew had been absorbed into consortium land sometime in the late 1880s, and which now supplied water to the consortium's distribution network. Water that Cobb charged the valley's farmers at rates that had increased 3 times in the past 4 years, and that several families were now struggling to meet. She thought about the word consortium, which meant, in theory, a shared arrangement, but which in practice, in Kalita Flats, meant Harlan Cobb and 2 men who voted as he directed. She thought about Celestina Berrendo, who would be 14 years old now if she was alive, and who was in Mesilla, 20 miles south, and who did not know that the deed to her father's land was folded in oilskin in a flour bin in a bakery that had just been purchased for $3. And then Nora did what her mother had always done when the arithmetic of a situation became clear. She began to plan. The first thing she needed was a lawyer, and she had $1.58. The second thing she needed was a witness, and she had something better than a witness. She had the Spanish letter, which she took the following morning to Padre Aurelio at the church on Calle Tercera, who read it in its entirety without interrupting, and then sat for a full minute with his hands folded on his desk before looking up and telling Nora that what she was holding was a deposition, essentially a legal account of coercion and land fraud, and that if it could be authenticated, it would constitute serious evidence against a man who had been, for Padre Aurelio, a source of private suspicion for many years. The authentication took 3 weeks. Nora spent those weeks replastering the dome oven with materials she obtained on credit from the hardware merchant by leaving her mother's rolling pin as collateral, which cost her something real, and she baked bread in the old Berendo oven for the first time on a Thursday morning in early October, selling it from the doorway of the adobe for 2 cents a loaf, less than the only other baker in town, and the people of Kalita Flats came to her, cautiously at first, and then with increasing regularity, because the bread was good and the price was honest, and because Nora Vane had a quality that her father had possessed, a kind of visible integrity that made people feel they were being treated fairly, which is not as common in commerce as it ought to be. She sent a letter to Messila. She sent it through Padre Aurelio, who had connections there, and she waited. Harlan Cobb heard about the bakery within the first week and came to see it himself, arriving on a morning when Nora was carrying a tray of rolls to the doorway, and he looked at the building and then at her, with an expression that was politely dismissive, the look of a man who does not perceive a threat in what he is seeing, because what he is seeing is a woman in an apron selling bread from a renovated ruin. He said he was glad to see the old place put to use again, and he bought a roll and he left. He came back 2 weeks later, and this time his expression was different. It had reached him, by then, that someone was asking questions about the Berendo land. He did not know about the letter. He did not know about the deed. He knew only that Padre Aurelio had been in conversation with a territorial land records examiner and that the examiner had been asking for documentation related to a consortium land acquisition from 1886, and that these two facts had, in the arithmetic of a guilty mind, added up to something alarming. He came to the bakery, and he was still courteous, but the courtesy had a different quality now. It was the courtesy of a man who is deciding how afraid he needs to be, and of what. He asked Nora, in a roundabout way, whether she had found anything of interest in the old building when she moved in. Nora told him she had found a great deal of dust and a very good oven. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man measuring whether he is being told the truth or being managed, and then he bought another roll and left again. The reply from Messila came on a Wednesday. Celestina Berendo was alive. She was living with her aunt, a woman named Senora Lucia Berendo de Paz, who was 61 years old and in poor health, and who had raised Celestina alone since Tomas had sent the girl south in the spring of 1886 with nothing but a note and the clothes she was wearing. Celestina was 15 now, not 14. Nora had miscalculated. She had been working in a dry goods store since she was 11. She could read in 2 languages and do sums in her head faster than most adults. Padre Aurelio's contact in Messila described her as a serious girl with a careful manner and a quality of attention that made people around her feel they were being seen accurately, which was, Nora thought, the most interesting way she had ever heard someone described. Celestina arrived in Kalita Flats on a Thursday morning in November, on the southbound stage, carrying a small bag and wearing a coat that was too light for the season. She was taller than Nora expected, and she had her father's careful eyes that moved over a room the way a person reads a page, taking things in with a kind of systematic thoroughness. She sat across from Nora in the bakery's back room, which Nora had furnished with 2 chairs and a small table and a lamp, and she read her father's letter for the first time in her life, and she did not cry while she was reading it. She cried after, briefly and quietly, and then she wiped her face and asked Nora what the next step was. The land records examiner had, by this point, completed his preliminary assessment. The Mexican grant deed in the oilskin packet was authentic, authenticated by 3 separate experts, including a professor of land history from the University of New Mexico who had made the trip from Albuquerque specifically because the document was, in his words, a remarkably clean example of a pre-territorial grant in a period when such documents are often compromised or disputed. The deed superseded the consortium's claim to the 42 acres, which had been obtained through a process that the examiner's report described, in careful bureaucratic language, as procedurally irregular in ways that invite further review. Further review came in the form of a territorial hearing, which was held in the county seat in December of 1893, and which Nora attended with Celestina on one side and Padre Aurelio on the other, and which Harlan Cobb attended with 2 lawyers and an expression of controlled, expensive confidence. The confidence did not survive the presentation of the Spanish letter. Tomás Berendo had been, among other things, a meticulous man. The Spanish letter was not a general account of grievance. It was a specific, dated, detailed description of meetings, conversations, and actions, including the names of the 2 other men who had been present when Cobb had made his threat, one of whom was dead and one of whom was alive and living in the county seat, and who, when presented with the letter's contents and given the option of speaking voluntarily or being compelled to speak legally, chose voluntarily. His testimony corroborated Berendo's account in every material detail. Harlan Cobb resigned from the Water and Land Consortium chairmanship before the hearing's second day. He did not go to prison. The law in 1893 was not always equal to the justice a situation required, but he was removed from the consortium's governance structure, and the 42 Berendo acres were restored to Celestina by formal territorial order in February of 1894, along with a finding that the consortium's water rates had been set without proper public process and required renegotiation with the valley's farming community. The bank account, $412, held since 1886, grown with 7 years of simple interest to $491 and some cents, was released to Celestina in the same month. She used a portion of it to bring her aunt, Senora Lucia, from Mesilla to Calida Flats, and she leased the Berendo land to 2 farming families who had been struggling under the consortium's rates at terms her father would have recognized as fair. She enrolled in school. She came to the bakery every Saturday morning and helped Nora with the early baking, and she proved to have her father's feel for bread. The same patience, the same attentiveness to the way dough responds to temperature and humidity and the particular quality of the morning's air. Nora, for her part, rebuilt. She paid off the hardware merchant and reclaimed her mother's rolling pin. She established a credit account for families who needed it, as her mother had done, and she priced her goods in the way her mother had taught her, not at the minimum she needed to survive, but at the minimum the community could sustain. By the spring of 1894, the Berendo Bakery, she had taken to calling it that, quietly, in her own mind, as a way of honoring what the building actually was operating at a modest profit, and Nora had a room in the building's back section where she slept on a narrow bed with her mother's rolling pin on the shelf above her and the green-toothed key hanging on a nail beside the door. She wrote to Marguerite. The letter was not easy to write and took 3 drafts, but it said what it needed to say, which was that Nora understood what had happened and that she was not, in the way that would poison a person, angry. She was building something. She would be glad when Marguerite was able to have her sister's address. Aldous Prentice, it reached Nora the following year, had made another investment in Colorado that had resolved in the same direction as his previous ones, and he was working in a mill in Denver and sending money home to Marguerite in amounts that were, by all accounts, insufficient. This was not a fate Nora had arranged or wished for. It was simply the natural result of a man continuing to be who he had always been, in a world that eventually stops extending credit to that kind of consistency. We think about Nora Vane sometimes, when we consider what it means to find value in a thing the world has decided is worthless. The flour bin in the old Berendo bakery was not, to any reasonable observer in September of 1893, a promising piece of furniture. It was rust and old wood and a cracked hinge and the ghost of someone else's work. The building around it was $3 worth of stubbornness in adobe form, and the woman who bought both of them was the subject of a laughter that she heard and absorbed, and did not allow to alter her direction by a single degree. What she found inside was not treasure in the way stories usually mean treasure. It was a man's careful account of what had been taken from him, and a request, not a demand, not a curse, but a request, written in the quiet voice of someone who has accepted that they cannot fix a thing themselves and is asking the universe, in the form of whoever opens a flower bin next, to please try. Tomás Berendo had trusted his letter to the only vault he had available, which was a wooden box in the wall of a building he had built with his own hands, and he had been right to trust it, because the right person had come along eventually, the way right people often do, not dramatically, not in time to prevent the harm, but in time to address it. Nora Vane had come to that auction with $3 and a rolling pin, and the kind of stubborn, inherited belief in the usefulness of baking that had been shaped into her by a quiet man who hummed half-remembered hymns, and a mathematical woman who understood ecology. She had not come looking for a mystery. She had come looking for an oven. But she had found, as people who pay attention sometimes find, that the thing she needed and the thing she was needed for had arrived at the same address on the same afternoon, and that the flower bin in the north wall had been waiting, with the patience of good wood, for exactly this. She was 34 years old, and she had $4.60, and the whole world had written her off, and she had walked into a broken building and found inside it a piece of trust that a stranger had placed there for whoever came next, and she had honored it. That is the whole of it, really. That is the story of Nora Vane. Thank you for spending this time with us today. Stories like Nora's remind us that the things the world dismisses, a crumbling building, a rusted bin, a woman with empty pockets and a rolling pin, are sometimes the exact things carrying the most important freight. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked does not mean worthless, and that value often waits in the quietest places for the right hands to find it. We always love to read your thoughts in the comments, and we have one question for you today. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had written off? We would love to hear your story. Until next time, stay close